Hey everyone, tonight we're drifting back into the candlelit corridors of medieval Europe, into castles full of damp stone walls, suspicious soup, political grudges, and deeply unfortunate marriages arranged by men who believed hygiene caused weakness. So, dim the lights a little, maybe pull up a blanket, and together we'll wander through the long, strange lives of medieval queens, many of whom were sent away as children to marry complete strangers for the good of the kingdom. Because naturally, international diplomacy was mostly just fathers trading teenage daughters like decorative treaty documents with embroidery. And to make things even more comforting, these girls often traveled hundreds of miles through forests, mountains, and plague-ridden roads, only to discover their new husband was 40 years older, emotionally unstable, covered in ceremonial fur, and possibly named something reassuring like the Cruel or the Mad, which in fairness, medieval royalty did have a talent for honest branding. Still, these queens survived, some adapted brilliantly. Some became master politicians, some quietly endured lives of loneliness so complete it practically echoes through the centuries. And some looked around at the entire institution of monarchy and thought, very reasonable, this seems poorly organized. Tonight we'll move slowly through their stories. Their awkward arrivals, their terrifying wedding night, their strange customs, their tiny their catastrophically unhealthy family trees, and as always, we'll do it gently. Because nothing says relaxation quite like dynastic trauma. Let's begin with one of the most common experiences in medieval queenship, leaving home forever at around the age when modern children are worrying about algebra homework. A royal marriage usually began with paperwork, not romance, not affection, certainly not compatibility. Medieval Europe did not particularly care whether two people liked each other. The important thing was whether marrying them might stop a war for approximately 8 months. A princess could be promised in marriage before she learned to read, sometimes before she learned to walk, occasionally before she was born, which must have made baby showers slightly tense. Congratulations on the infant daughter. We've already pledged her to the Duke of Burgundy. Oh, lovely. Does he seem kind? No idea. He's 60. Royal daughters were political currency, soft-spoken little peace treaties with braided hair. And so a young girl might grow up knowing vaguely that one day she would be sent away. Her tutors prepared her for it constantly. She learned languages she might someday need, court etiquette, religious customs, how to sit still for 6 straight hours while listening to a bishop discuss morality, an endurance test that remains horrifying even now. Then eventually the day came. The princess would leave home with a massive procession, wagons creaking behind her, priests chanting, servants carrying chests full of linens, jewels, silverware, prayer books, and enough fabric to smother a medium-sized village. And somewhere in the distance, her mother was probably crying quietly, while her father calculated military alliances. The journey itself could take months. Roads were terrible. Weather was worse. Inns smelled like wet goats and despair. Rivers flooded constantly. Horses died, wheels snapped. Entire entourages got lost because medieval maps were often more optimistic than accurate. One 14th century traveler described alpine roads as suitable only for demons, which honestly feels fair. Imagine being 14 years old, exhausted, terrified, riding through freezing mountain passes toward a husband you've never met, while everyone around you keeps reminding you that your primary duty is producing sons before dying of childbirth. Very soothing atmosphere overall. One famous example was Anne of Bohemia, who traveled from Prague to England in 1382 to marry King Richard II of England. The trip was such a disaster that several ships sank, valuable treasures disappeared into the sea, and people immediately began deciding that the marriage was cursed. A deeply medieval response. If your luggage falls overboard today, you think that's inconvenient. If your luggage fell overboard in 1382, everyone assumed God opposed the wedding personally. Anne eventually reached England and met Richard, who was young, emotional, extravagant, and remarkably fond of fine clothing. Historians often describe him as artistic and sensitive, which translated from royal chroniclers sometimes means not especially interested in governing. Still, Richard genuinely adored Anne, surprisingly so. Their marriage appears to have been affectionate, which was uncommon enough to confuse everyone. Contemporaries kept waiting for scandal and instead found two people quietly enjoying each other's company. Very disappointing for the gossip industry. Anne worked hard to adapt to English customs. She learned the language, she mediated disputes, she softened Richard's harsher impulses. Chroniclers repeatedly noted her kindness. And perhaps that's one of the strangest things about medieval queenship. Many queens survived not through power but through emotional intelligence. A queen often had no army, no official authority, no independent wealth, but she could influence moods, soothe tempers, calm paranoia, ease tensions between explosive men wearing crowns and carrying unresolved childhood issues, which was unfortunately most kings. And kings were rarely emotionally healthy individuals. Take Charles VI of France, for example, a man whose reign slowly dissolved into madness. He suffered terrifying psychotic episodes in which he forgot his own identity, believed he was made of glass, or failed to recognize his wife entirely. His queen, Isabeau of Bavaria, spent years trying to manage an unraveling court while powerful nobles circled like vultures around a throne occupied by someone intermittently convinced he might shatter if touched. The glass delusion, as historians call it, appears repeatedly in medieval records. Several nobles believed themselves physically fragile, though Charles became the most famous example. Imagine trying to run a kingdom while your husband is refusing to sit down because he thinks his legs are made of crystal. And because this was medieval monarchy, naturally the political factions somehow made everything worse. Isabeau herself became deeply unpopular. Some accused her of extravagance, others blamed her for France's instability. Rumors spread constantly. Medieval courts thrived on rumor the way swamp water thrives on mosquitoes. But surviving court life often required impossible balancing acts. Queens had to appear dignified but not arrogant, fertile but modest, intelligent but never threatening, influential but somehow invisible at the same time. A queen who succeeded politically risked accusations of manipulation. A queen who failed was considered useless. And if she couldn't produce sons, everyone panicked immediately. The obsession with heirs dominated royal marriages completely. Childbirth haunted medieval queens from adolescence onward. Pregnancy followed pregnancy in relentless succession. Miscarriages were common, infant mortality was devastatingly high, queens buried children constantly. It becomes almost numbing when you read royal records. Delivered of a daughter, child survived 6 days. Delivered of a son, lived 3 weeks, weakened considerably. Then life simply continued. One of the most tragic examples was Catherine of Aragon, though technically she belongs slightly later than the medieval period. Still, her experience captures the emotional exhaustion of queenship perfectly. Catherine arrived in England from Spain as a teenager to marry Prince Arthur. Arthur died only months later, leaving Catherine stranded in political limbo. And here medieval diplomacy revealed its truly uncomfortable side. Rather than sending her home, negotiations eventually arranged for Catherine to marry Arthur's younger brother instead. That younger brother became Henry VIII, which, as future historical developments would strongly suggest, was not ideal. For years, Catherine endured pregnancies that ended in grief, miscarriages, stillbirths, dead infants, one surviving daughter, Mary. Henry grew increasingly desperate for a male heir, then resentful, then obsessive, then catastrophically theatrical about the entire matter because Henry VIII approached personal problems the way medieval kings often did, by detonating institutions. Catherine handled the situation with extraordinary composure. She refused to quietly disappear, refused to admit her marriage was invalid, refused to surrender her dignity even while isolated from court and separated from her daughter. There's something hauntingly calm about many surviving descriptions of her final years. A woman abandoned politically, emotionally exhausted, physically worn down by repeated pregnancies, and still maintaining ceremonial grace because queenship had become part of her identity. Medieval queens learned endurance early. Sometimes that endurance turned into remarkable political skill. Consider Eleanor of Aquitaine, a woman so energetic she almost feels misplaced in the Middle Ages. Eleanor inherited one of the richest territories in Europe. She married King Louis VII of France. The marriage began awkwardly and deteriorated steadily, partly because Louis was deeply pious and possibly better suited to monastery life. Meanwhile, Eleanor enjoyed culture, politics, music, luxury, conversation, and generally existing as a fully alive human being. The mismatch became impossible. They traveled together on the Second Crusade where tensions exploded spectacularly. Rumors circulated endlessly. Eleanor supposedly criticized military decisions. Louis grew resentful and humiliated. Eventually, the marriage was annulled, and then Eleanor did something extraordinary. She married Henry Plantagenet shortly afterward, who became Henry II of England. This gave her even greater political importance than before. Also, unfortunately, Henry II was emotionally volcanic. The Plantagenet family in general operated like a traveling festival of interpersonal dysfunction. Their sons rebelled repeatedly, everyone screamed at each other across France for decades. Alliances shifted constantly, at least one family meeting probably deserved exorcism. Eleanor herself was imprisoned for years after supporting her son's revolt against Henry, which sounds unbearable. Yet, even in confinement, she remained politically significant. After Henry's death, she returned to influence public affairs again in her 70s. At an age when most medieval people hoped to quietly survive soup, Eleanor was still organizing kingdoms. An absolute menace to the concept of retirement. And yet, for every Eleanor, there were dozens of queens who vanished quietly into ceremonial obscurity. Women married abroad who never fully learned the language. Women isolated among hostile courtiers. Women treated as foreign intrusions whenever politics turned sour. Foreign queens were easy scapegoats. If taxes increased, blame the foreign queen. Bad harvest? Probably her fault somehow. King behaving irrationally? Clearly the foreign wife bewitched him. A surprisingly durable medieval explanation. Anne Boleyn later faced similar accusations. So did Marie Antoinette centuries afterward. Foreignness itself became suspicious, and court life could be astonishingly lonely. Imagine entering a palace where every smile might hide calculation. Servants reported conversations. Nobles competed for influence. Religious expectations hovered constantly. Your body belonged to the dynasty, your children belonged to the state, even your grief was political. Queens were expected to mourn correctly, dress correctly, smile correctly, produce heirs correctly, worship correctly. A slightly wrong expression during a diplomatic banquet could generate 3 months of rumors. Naturally, many queens developed intense religious devotion. Religion offered structure, comfort, identity, sometimes actual personal space. Um, Convents became places of refuge for royal women exhausted by politics. Some widowed queens retired gratefully into religious life where, for the first time in decades, nobody demanded pregnancies or treaty negotiations. Others founded monasteries, commissioned prayers, collected relics, and devoted enormous energy to securing salvation. Which made sense. If you survived medieval court life, you probably wanted spiritual reassurance from absolutely every available source, and the church was very happy to help, usually for a fee. Medieval royal marriages also involved endless ceremonial performance. Public appearances mattered tremendously. Queens processed through cities in elaborate gowns, heavy enough to qualify as architectural structures. Crowns glittered under candlelight. Musicians played. Clergy blessed things repeatedly. The symbolism never stopped. Every gesture meant something. Every outfit communicated hierarchy. Even childbirth became public theater. In some courts, witnesses attended royal births to confirm the baby genuinely emerged from the queen and had not been secretly swapped, which feels invasive enough without considering the complete absence of modern anesthesia. And yet, despite all this pressure, many queens formed meaningful friendships. Ladies in waiting became emotional lifelines. Correspondence with relatives offered comfort across great distances. Some queens built intellectual circles around themselves, filled with poets, scholars, musicians, and clerics, small islands of humanity inside giant political machines. There's something deeply moving about those quieter details. A queen requesting books from home, a mother writing letters to distant children, a foreign bride slowly learning local songs. Tiny moments of ordinary feelings surviving within systems designed mostly for power, and perhaps that's why these stories still linger. Because behind all the crowns and ceremonies were often very young people trying to adapt to impossible circumstances. Teenagers expected to stabilize kingdoms. Women blamed for dynastic failure. Couples thrown together by treaty negotiations and told to produce national stability immediately, which even by medieval standards seems ambitious. And unfortunately, the dynasties themselves only grew stranger over time. Because once royal families discovered the political convenience of marrying cousins, they became astonishingly committed to the concept. But we'll drift into that wonderfully alarming territory next time, where chins became legendary, bloodlines folded inward like badly assembled furniture, and Europe's royal families collectively ignored several very obvious warning signs, which, as it turns out, was practically a tradition. Welcome back, everyone. Tonight we'll continue drifting through the strange and deeply exhausting lives of medieval queens. So settle in again, adjust the blankets, Perhaps imagine the comforting sound of rain against castle windows, assuming the roof has not collapsed, which in medieval structures remained more of an aspiration than a guarantee. Last time we spoke about young royal brides crossing continents to marry strangers, about loneliness, court politics, and the quiet endurance queens developed simply to survive daily life among ambitious noblemen wearing emotionally complicated hats. Tonight we wander deeper into the dynasties themselves, into the world of cousin marriages and uncle marriages, and occasionally arrangements so genetically confusing that medieval priests themselves paused briefly before approving them anyway for political convenience. Because if there was one thing European royalty truly feared, it was marrying someone new. The medieval ruling class liked familiarity, familiar land, familiar alliances, familiar bloodlines, ideally all at once, which meant the same families married each other over and over again, until entire royal houses began resembling elaborate family wreaths rather than trees. And the queens caught inside these dynasties often carried the burden physically. Their bodies became the battleground where politics and genetics collided in slow motion. A medieval royal wedding usually sounded grand on paper: gold embroidery, velvet cloaks, sacred vows, choirs echoing through enormous cathedrals thick with incense. But beneath all the ceremony lurked one persistent concern: inheritance. Who owned which territory? Who might claim which throne? Whose children could inherit what collection of damp castles and financially unstable provinces? Love barely entered the discussion. Shared DNA, unfortunately, entered it constantly. The church technically opposed close blood relations in marriage. At various points, medieval canon law banned unions between cousins extending outward to astonishing degrees. For a while, the prohibited range became so large that practically every noble family in Europe qualified as related somehow, which should perhaps have been interpreted as a warning. Instead, royal courts treated it as paperwork. Dispensations were requested, bishops negotiated exceptions, genealogies were adjusted creatively. Suddenly, everyone discovered a theological reason why this particular cousin marriage was completely acceptable in the eyes of God, because naturally heaven remained extremely invested in preserving border agreements. One queen who entered this tangled world early was Blanche of Castile. Blanche married the future Louis VIII of France while still very young. Her marriage had been arranged to strengthen ties between England and France, though medieval diplomacy between those kingdoms resembled two angry cats trapped in a sack together. Still, Blanche adapted remarkably well. She became politically formidable, intelligent, disciplined, and fiercely protective of her children, especially her son, the future Louis IX, later known as Saint Louis, which sounds noble and serene. But raising medieval kings was less peaceful than the title suggests. Royal childhoods were strange environments full of constant surveillance, strict ceremony, and adults quietly panicking about succession. Children mattered enormously because mortality rates were horrifying. A queen might produce 10 children and watch half disappear before adolescence. Every fever became terrifying. Every cough triggered whispers about dynastic collapse. And because medieval medicine operated somewhere between herbal experimentation and optimistic superstition, treatment often made everything worse. Physicians prescribed bloodletting for astonishing numbers of conditions: headache, remove blood; fever, more blood removal; weakness caused by excessive blood removal; surprisingly, also bloodletting, a medical system powered largely by confidence. Queens endured endless pregnancies under these conditions. No antibiotics, no pain relief worth mentioning, minimal understanding of infection. And yet royal women were expected to continue producing heirs relentlessly because kingdoms depended on it. Blanche herself survived multiple pregnancies and eventually acted as regent for her son during his minority. She managed rebellious nobles, others political instability, and crusading ambitions while maintaining authority in a deeply male political world. Not by dramatic speeches or battlefield heroics, mostly through persistence, administrative skill, patience, strategic alliances, and probably an incredible tolerance for irritating men explaining things unnecessarily. Many successful queens mastered this quieter style of survival. They learned when to flatter, when to remain silent, when to subtly manipulate events behind the scenes. Open displays of female authority often frightened medieval chroniclers who reacted to politically active queens with the same energy modern people reserve for finding raccoons inside kitchen cabinets. Concerned fascination. One queen described repeatedly in suspicious terms was Margaret of Anjou, wife of Henry VI of England. Henry VI was gentle, deeply religious, and catastrophically unsuited to ruling during a political crisis. He suffered periods of mental collapse so severe he became almost entirely unresponsive for months. Unfortunately, this occurred while England dissolved into the Wars of the Roses, an absolutely exhausting conflict where several branches of royalty spent decades murdering each other over flower symbols. The white rose, the red rose, very elegant branding for national instability. Margaret found herself forced into political leadership because her husband could not govern effectively. She organized armies, negotiated alliances, protected her son's claim to the throne, and naturally many contemporaries hated her for it. Aggressive male rulers were considered decisive. Aggressive queens were considered unnatural, a frustratingly durable historical pattern. Still, Margaret kept fighting because queens often had very little choice. If their husband failed politically, they were dragged down with him. If their son lost succession, their entire position collapsed. Survival required adaptability, and adaptability became especially important inside increasingly inbred dynasties. Nowhere became more infamous for this than the Habsburg family. Though much of their most dramatic genetic collapse arrived after the medieval era, the foundations began earlier through generations of carefully arranged royal marriages. The Habsburg strategy was simple. Others wage war. You marry people instead. Unfortunately, after enough generations, the family tree started resembling a decorative ladder. Uncles married nieces, first cousins married repeatedly, entire branches folded inward genetically until portraits began displaying the same elongated faces, heavy jaws, and mournful expressions over and over again like increasingly distressed potatoes. The famous Habsburg jaw became especially pronounced. A protruding lower jaw combined with enlarged facial features and various health complications. By the time of Charles II of Spain, the dynasty had essentially speedrun several centuries of genetic warning signs. Charles struggled to eat properly, speak clearly, walk steadily, produce heirs. Contemporaries described him with a mixture of pity and alarm. One ambassador noted that the king looked more dead than alive, which is not the ideal tone for diplomatic correspondence. And yet, throughout all these generations, queens continued entering these families from abroad, expected to somehow stabilize courts already vibrating with paranoia, illness, and succession panic. Imagine arriving as a teenage bride into a palace where everyone shares the same unsettling chin, and several relatives may genuinely believe evil spirits caused gout. A difficult adjustment period. One woman who experienced the emotional isolation of foreign queenship profoundly was Elizabeth of York. Now technically slightly later than medieval Europe again, but emotionally very much connected to its traditions. Elizabeth married Henry VII after the Wars of the Roses ended, uniting rival dynasties symbolically. Their marriage helped stabilize England after decades of violence, which sounds romantic in hindsight. In reality, it was political damage control with embroidery. Still, unlike many arranged marriages, theirs appears relatively functional. Henry respected Elizabeth. She provided legitimacy to his fragile new dynasty. Together, they projected calm stability, although calm in Tudor England always meant someone nearby was probably still plotting treason. Elizabeth's role illustrates another survival strategy medieval queens mastered: performance. Queens performed serenity constantly, even during grief, even during uncertainty, even while surrounded by political danger. Ceremony became armor. A queen learned exactly how to enter a room, how to acknowledge nobles, how to display controlled emotion without revealing weakness. And beneath all that ritualized elegance, many were profoundly isolated. Royal women often lost contact with siblings permanently after marriage abroad. Letters traveled slowly. Travel itself was dangerous. Some queens never saw their families again. Imagine leaving home at 13 and realizing gradually that everything familiar has vanished forever. Different language, different food, different customs, different expectations. And somewhere beside you sits a husband who may regard conversation as an optional activity. Medieval masculinity did not encourage emotional openness. Kings were raised for authority, warfare, and dynastic duty. Affection came second, if at all. Some royal marriages developed tenderness slowly over time. Others remained cold formal arrangements for decades. A few became openly hostile. One particularly bleak example was Joanna of Castile, later called Joanna the Mad, though historians debate the fairness of that title intensely. Joanna married Philip the Handsome, a man famous for being extremely attractive and deeply irresponsible, a dangerous combination historically. Joanna genuinely loved Philip. Unfortunately, Philip treated marriage fidelity more as an interesting philosophical suggestion than a personal commitment. Joanna became consumed with jealousy and emotional instability. Court gossip amplified every outburst dramatically because royal courts treated female emotion like public theater. Meanwhile, Philip pursued power aggressively. After his sudden death, Joanna's grief became legendary. Stories spread claiming she traveled with his coffin for extended periods, refusing burial. Some details were likely exaggerated. Medieval chroniclers adored dramatic women suffering visibly. Still, Joanna spent much of her later life isolated and confined, while male relatives governed around her, a queen reduced from political importance to tragic symbol. And this happened repeatedly. Queens who failed to produce heirs, queens deemed mentally unstable, queens whose husbands lost power, queens who aged beyond political usefulness. All could find themselves quietly pushed aside. Royal life was glamorous from a distance. Up close, it was often claustrophobic, exhausting, and frighteningly precarious. Even successful queens lived under constant observation. Take court etiquette alone. Meals occurred publicly. Religious ceremonies occurred publicly. Dressing rituals sometimes occurred publicly. Some queens had attendants sleeping nearby constantly. Privacy barely existed. One wrong comment could become diplomatic scandal by sunset. And because medieval courts lacked modern entertainment, people compensated through gossip with almost athletic dedication. Rumors flourished everywhere. Was the queen pregnant? Was the king impotent? Did the marriage remain consummated? Did someone poison the prince? Did the queen secretly favor foreign interests? Did she laugh slightly too hard during dinner? Clearly suspicious. Entire political factions formed around interpreting facial expressions incorrectly. Yet, amidst all this absurdity, queens still managed moments of genuine humanity. Some became devoted mothers despite the formal distance royal protocol encouraged. Others sponsored art, literature, and education. Some protected religious minorities or mediated conflicts quietly. Many served as patrons of architecture and culture, shaping medieval courts far more than chroniclers acknowledged. Their influence survived in quieter ways. A manuscript commissioned here, a monastery funded there, a marriage negotiation preventing war temporarily. Tiny acts of stability inside endlessly unstable worlds. And perhaps that's what survival really meant for medieval queens. Not happiness necessarily, not freedom, but endurance.